Welcome. You are at the 2025 Project Support Application Workshop. Welcome. You are welcome to introduce yourself in the chat, or if you feel like coming off of mute and introducing yourself briefly, feel free. It's good to see so many of you. I'm giving it just a brief moment. Oh, Chaz, were you going to say hi?
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say hi. My name is Chaz Hawks. I'm the operations director for House of Transcendent.
Hi, it's so good to meet you. I know we talked on
Nice
the
to meet
phone,
you.
but it's good to see your face.
Yes, nice to meet you.
Great. As a review, this is for the application workshop. So if you are a grantee who is bypassing the application and panel process and you have specific questions, please reach out to your grant manager, because in this workshop, we're only going to cover the actual 2025 application. Just want to note that. Okay, well, you know what? We're going to go ahead and get started, if that is okay with all of you. And I'm going to turn it over to Julia.
Thank you. So welcome, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that the land we stand on and the place that we call Cuyahoga County is land that was claimed by the United States government through force, displacement, and treaties negotiated in bad faith. We acknowledge those of the Shawnee, Miami, Erie, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and Haudenosaunee Confederacy, whose lands we stand on, and the thousands of Native Americans representing over 100 tribes who currently live in Northeast Ohio today. And we thank the Lake Erie Native American Council for helping us develop this acknowledgement. We also want to take a moment to share that CAC values equity. We choose to lead with racial equity in our work because the creation and perpetuation of racial inequalities is embedded into government and grant making. We confront the white supremacy that resides in our work because racial inequities across all indicators of success are deep and pervasive. We also recognize the power and potential that organizations who produce arts and cultural programming have as bearers of culture. These institutions have the power to write the narrative about who belongs and who is valued, and we encourage arts and cultural organizations to connect with resources to advance equity in your own work. You can visit cacgrants.org/equity or contact one of us, your grant manager, to learn more. So thanks again for joining us today. This is Cuyahoga Arts and Culture's 2025 Project Support Application Workshop. I'm Julia Carey. I'm a grants manager here at CAC. We also have Maya Curtis, who is co-presenting today, and Davon Nichols is our third grants manager, also in the room. The other members of our grant making team include Laura Matteo, who's our grant making and communications associate, and Jake Sinatra, our director of grant making, strategy, and communication. So if you're just joining us, we invite you to introduce yourself in the chat. Once again, Project Support Application Workshop for 2025. And Davon, I think he has the link to the grant manager's contact information that he can drop in as well. So we will hold some time to answer questions at the end of the presentation today, but feel free to be in touch with us if we can be of assistance to you as you move through the process, or to drop questions in the chat as they come up as well. So at this point in our cycle, CAC has completed the eligibility check phase of our 2025 grant cycle, and organizations at this workshop have been determined to be eligible to apply for a project support grant. The next phase of our process is the application, which is what we'll speak to today. If your organization was approved to skip the application and panel process this year because you were approved to complete the same project as 2024, bypassing the application process, you'll instead complete the 2025 project form. We won't be reviewing the project form today, but if you have questions about it, you can contact your grant manager and we can connect around that. In this workshop, we will talk about the program goals and a general overview of project support, the funding criteria, the application, next steps after the application, and of course, we'll leave room for questions. So I will hand it back to Maya, who will talk about the grant program.
Thank you, Julia. So the content we're discussing today comes directly from CAC's 2025 Project Support Guidelines. This document outlines the grant cycle and it serves as the roadmap for CAC's staff. It is approved by CAC's board and is shared publicly with applicants as well as our panelists. I encourage you all to give it a close read as you're getting ready to work on your application. And I think Davon can share our guidelines link in the chat. Again, really encourage you to give that a read before or while you're completing the application. The purpose of Cuyahoga Arts and Culture's Project Support Grant Program is to promote public access and encourage the breadth of arts and cultural programming in our community by supporting Cuyahoga County-based organizations and projects. We define a project as a specific, connected set of activities with a beginning and an end, explicit goals, objectives, and a predetermined cost that does not equal the organization's total annual budget. Project support is a matching grant. So for grants of $5,000 or less, 50% of the match can be in kind. For project support grants over $5,000, the match must be cash, which could include other grants, donations, ticket revenue, sponsorships, anything of that sort. For an application to be approved to go to panel, it must meet our definition of a project. So as I mentioned, projects may be one-time events such as a festival or exhibit, or a clearly connected series of events such as a roster of classes or a series of productions. Projects must start and end in the 2025 calendar year. Each project needs a distinct start and end date that fall within the calendar year but is not the full year. Projects must be arts or cultural activities with a public programming component. And we'll talk more about how we define arts and culture here on the next slide. Projects must take place in Cuyahoga County, in case that wasn't obvious, and they should be open to the public. Open to the public does not mean that the project or program must be free. It just needs to be a program that can and will be advertised broadly and is welcoming to visitor participants. Arts and culture is defined in the Ohio Revised Code, Chapter 3381, which is CAC's enabling law, as including, but not limited to, literature, theater, music, dance, ballet, painting, sculpture, photography, motion pictures, architecture, archaeology, history, natural history, or the natural sciences. And I'll take a moment to highlight that CAC's definition of arts and culture includes the natural sciences. This means that we fund science and nature-based programming in addition to the other disciplines like music, performing arts, and visual art. A few areas that do not fit within our definition of arts and culture include yoga, language classes, and martial arts. It's fine if projects include some of these activities, but it must primarily be an arts and culture project by our definition. Projects must meet the definition, and your grant manager is happy to speak with you further if you have specific questions about what your project is going to entail. CAC project support projects must have a public programming component or some part of your project open to Cuyahoga County residents. Some examples could include public concerts, events, activities, festivals, but they should be open to county residents. Alternatively, your project can feature public programming around a public display of the arts and culture component of your project. Open to the public does not mean that your project or program must be free. And so for an example, a mural by itself would not be an eligible application because it does not include a public programming component. There would also need to be an event that was open to the public, or maybe it's a series of workshops led by the muralist that is open to the public. Some type of public programming must be included for the project to be considered eligible. If you have any questions about this component and how it applies to your specific project, please review the project support guidelines, or again, feel free to contact us. Next, we're going to talk about your CAC request amount and budget. You have received an email informing you that your organization has been moved to the application round and indicating your maximum request amount. This number is calculated based on the information you submitted in the eligibility check. You may request any amount up to that maximum request amount. If you don't know your maximum request amount, please contact your grant manager and we'll be happy to get that information for you. Your request amount can be no more than half of the overall project cost. So for example, if you're eligible for a grant amount of $5,000, then you must submit a project with a total budget of at least $10,000 to be eligible for that full amount. Okay, so what can CAC funds be used for? This is important to keep in mind as you're preparing the budget that will be proposed along with your project. In addition to direct costs like artist fees, supplies, marketing materials, your CAC grant can include administrative costs and logistics, such as permits, security, porta potties. Costs for things that help facilitate your arts and culture project are acceptable. CAC grants cannot be used for receptions, international travel, activities outside of Cuyahoga County, or components of your project that don't relate to arts and culture. So for example, the bouncy house at a street festival. It's not arts and culture and not a necessary tool to produce the arts and culture component. It's okay if these are part of your project, but they can't be covered by the CAC funding. So when you're completing that budget, you shouldn't be listing the CAC funding as covering those components. The CAC guidelines have a comprehensive list of funding restrictions, so be sure to review it. Again, that was a high level of things that we commonly see come up, but to review the entire list, please look at the guidelines. PS grants are matching grants, which means grantees must match the CAC grant with other funds. So for grants that are larger than $5,000, this must be all cash. Again, we mentioned it could be ticket sales, other grants, donations, anything like that. And for those smaller, up to half the match can be in kind. Matching funds can come from other grants. Okay, I already mentioned that, sorry, donations and ticket sales. And so for in kind, that could be volunteer hours, that could be space that was donated, anything like that. But the match cannot come from other CAC grants, from another organization that is funded by CAC grant. And now I'm going to turn it over to Julia.
Great. So here are a few pictures from some of the events and activities that have been supported by CAC funding in the past. We're really excited to hear about your 2025 projects. We have talked a lot so far about the technical requirements and restrictions of CAC's project support grant. But in this next section, we'll be diving into the application process and how your organization can be successful in this step of the process. I want to acknowledge that this is a lot of information. We are going to hold time at the end for questions, but if you are having questions come up now, also please feel free to add them into the chat and we can stop and address them when it makes sense. So the funding criteria. CAC's funding criteria are public benefit, artistic and cultural vibrancy, and organizational capacity. Public benefit, which is listed on top, carries the most weight in the grant review process. Funding criteria are important to consider when you're working on your application because panelists will assess all parts of your application with consideration to the funding criteria. They're the rubric that your application is scored with. The funding criteria ensure that all applications are judged by the same standards. So if your application shows sufficient evidence of meeting CAC's funding criteria, you'll be eligible for funding. Applications for more than $5,000 are scored using a 100-point scale, and 45 of those points are assigned to public benefit. A minimum of 75 points are required for an organization to be funded. For those applications of $5,000 or less, applications are scored on a simplified framework, which also emphasizes public benefit. So as you're working on the application, take the time to read through the full definitions of each funding criteria in the program guidelines. There's a clear link between the 3 funding criteria and our questions in the application. to help applicants show that they're meeting the requirements for our funding. All of our funding criteria should thread through your application, but there's a few key questions that address the criterion directly. And so it's a good idea to have the funding criteria page of the guidelines open or handy when you're working on your application. The panelists will likely be doing the same thing when they're reviewing. So let's spend a few minutes to cover each of the funding criteria and talk about where and how you might address each of them in your application. The first here is public benefit, which is an organization's ability to meaningfully connect with its community through its project. This is the criteria, again, with the most points attached to it. A few examples of public benefit might be inviting neighbors to serve on an advisory board, marketing the program broadly, or training volunteers to ensure all participants feel welcome. In the application, there's a few questions directly referencing public benefit. The first being define your community, and how will you connect with your community through your project? How will you be inclusive and engage diverse populations? When answering the first question about community, you can show that you truly know your organization's community by being specific. A community may be defined by geography, identity, or affinity. Every project will be serving a different community, and your community is very unlikely to be all of Cuyahoga County, and that's okay. A strong project is one that centers its community, but is welcoming and inclusive of the wider public. In the second question, you can speak to how your organization's programming is inviting to a wide scope of people, how the programming is a place where anyone can feel welcome and how they belong, and how you're making that happen. Our next criteria is artistic and cultural vibrancy, which is an organization's ability to create a relevant and engaging project. This is not the same thing as artistic excellence or quality, and we intentionally don't use those terms because they're very subjective. In the application, you'll address this through the question, how will your organization create a relevant and engaging project? Some examples of how to implement artistic and cultural vibrancy might be paying artists fairly for their time and expertise, recruiting instructors from diverse backgrounds to provide fresh programming, and surveying participants, and evolving programming based on their feedback. The last criterion is organizational capacity. It is an organization's ability to successfully manage resources. This is the least heavily emphasized of the funding criteria, but is still important to ensure that we're being good stewards of public dollars. The questions associated with this criteria are describe your team, include who will be involved and how they're qualified, and how will you measure success for your project. A good example of showing organizational capacity is by setting SMART-y goals and measuring progress and impact, clearly articulating the project timeline through the application, and demonstrating belonging as an organizational value so that all involved can thrive. So I've mentioned this word belonging and welcome, things like that a couple times now, and we do define belonging and several other important terms in our glossary, which is linked in the guidelines, and we can share now as well. Words like diverse, sharing power, community, and others are all in the glossary. So belonging in particular is about an unwavering commitment to not simply tolerating and respecting difference, but to ensure that all people are welcome and feel that they belong in a given space. This graphic, which comes from John A. Powell and the Othering and Belonging Institute, is a great example of that. Belonging is not just about inviting people into the circle, but expanding it. For example, bringing more chairs in. It's about bridging between differences, not requiring people to change or integrate. It's about co-creating and co-owning. In organizations and institutions, this concept should be present at all levels, not just in an education or outreach department, but especially in leadership where power is held. Belonging in practice will look different at every organization, but it will not include tokenizing people of color, extractive partnerships with smaller organizations, or outreach programs into communities where you have no trusting relationships built. Applications that don't demonstrate understanding and respect for their community will not be recommended for funding, and organizations that do cultivate belonging throughout their work will be able to demonstrate strong connection to our funding criteria. So I'll pass it back to Maya, who's going to talk a little bit more about the details of the application.
Great. So now that you have that context, we're going to spend some time talking about the actual application. We aren't going to go through each question, but we'll go over each section of the application. And if Davon can drop the link to the application instructions, we have the PDF of the application so you can review the questions that are included before you begin completing it, if that's your preferred way of reviewing information. Remember that panelists are looking for evidence of the 3 funding criteria throughout your entire application. So first, there will be the organizational overview. That's just going to include your mission statement, organizational history, and your 2024 organization expenses. The next section is project basics, which is a bullet point summary of your project. And then you'll move to the application narrative. That's where you will connect your application to the funding criteria that Julia just covered. Those are the questions we just went over. And then the project budget and financials. Here you will share your plan to raise matching income. You don't need to have these income sources committed or in the bank at the time of your application, but your plan should be detailed enough to inspire confidence that your organization can meet the matching requirement. You'll also be asked to explain the project's expense categories. Where's the money going to go? Specifically, what will you spend the CAC funds on? Again, that's a really great moment to reference what are eligible expenses through CAC's guidelines. You should try to anticipate what questions a panelist might have about your budget and use the optional narrative questions in the finance section to explain. The SMU Data Arts Funder Report is for organizations whose maximum grant amount is more than $5,000. This section is required for those who are, again, completing it with the maximum grant request amount of more than $5,000. Completing this separate survey and pulling the CAC funders report will take a bit of time and require programmatic and budget information about your organization. The cultural data profile should include your 2 most recently completed fiscal years. If you need help with this step, we have a great workshop video on our project support website. Maybe some of you were able to attend the review that we had last week. I know that SMU hosted one, but they have it recorded. So if that's something that you're interested in working on or watching, and they also have a really great, they have really great assistance. They're very responsive if you have questions as you're completing the funder report. Your grant amount will be adjusted to $5,000 if you do not complete the CDP and if you have a grant, sorry, I'm twisting my words. If you have a grant request amount over $5,000 and you do not complete the CDP, your amount will be adjusted to $5,000, but not disqualified entirely. So support materials. Your support materials enhance the narrative and help bring your project to life and are very important for the application. They can be images, videos, links to online pages, survey results, letters of support, or anything else that can help a panelist understand your organization or project. Panelists will review up to 3 support materials. Don't overload them with information. Like example, if you are including an entire script, I wouldn't anticipate a panelist to read an entire script, but do bring your project or organization to life by creating a photo collage rather than having one photo, for example. Consider how you can demonstrate the 3 funding criteria, especially public benefit, in your chosen support materials. Both the Data Arts Funder Report and support materials are important application components that are worth your time and effort to consider. We have an FAQ sheet about both linked on the last page of the guidelines that can help with these pieces that I really recommend looking at when you get there. Project support applications are due on Thursday, August 1st at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Late and incomplete applications will not be accepted. Once applications are submitted, grant managers complete a first review of applications to make sure they're eligible to go to panel. The next step is panel review. We invite panels of experts to review applications in online panels, either providing written feedback or meeting virtually for a live streamed interactive panel. Panelists score based on how projects meet the funding criteria. Scores over 75 out of 100 points are recommended for funding. Most organizations receive a percentage of their request amount. Those scores and recommendations are then approved at the regular meeting of our Board of Trustees in November. After funding recommendations are approved by the board, the 2025 grant year begins on January 1st. CAC grants are reimbursement grants, but you may receive up to 60% of your grant before you complete your project by submitting an advance payment request. All grantees will submit a final report, which is due 30 days after the project is complete, to receive your grant payment, or the remainder of your grant payment if you chose to do an advance payment. We also understand projects can change between the application period and implementation, or even once the planning process begins. For any changes to your project after your for any changes to your project after you're recommended for funding, please contact the CAC team for approval first. Again, as a reminder, you can find this information in the 2025 guidelines. Before we close and move to questions, we just want to highlight that we offer application office hours. Office hours are hosted by our team to help with the application process and requirements. This is an informal space just for applicants to help answer any final questions as you complete your application. You are always welcome to reach out to your grant manager with any questions you might have. You don't need to wait specifically for the application office hours. So feel free to email us or give us a call, and we're happy to talk through them then, because we do encourage you to start your application as early as possible. But in the week of, we also offer the application office hours if there's just some lingering questions, and this is a convenient time for you. And with that, we thank you for joining us today and welcome any questions you might have. I am going to ask Davon if there are any questions in the chat.
Not at this moment.
Exciting. I've answered every single question that could possibly be asked. Well, if there's any questions that are coming up for anyone right now,
One came through.
I'm going to end slideshow.
So the question was from Teresa Phillips, and it said, my organization did not do the eligibility form. Does that disqualify us from applying?
You did. What organization is this with? Or is that not included? If you didn't complete the eligibility check form and you haven't received an email stating that you're eligible to complete the application, then you're not able to complete the application at this stage. I hope that answers it. Gotcha. Yes, if you didn't complete the eligibility check, then the next time the eligibility will open will be in the spring of 2025. We're on a one-year cycle, so we accept eligibility eligibility forms in the spring of each year, and then applications are due in in summer and for the grant year for the next following year.
Yeah, I'm gonna drop into the chat the link to our sign up form so that when our next eligibility check opens up, you will be notified. So Taricha, if you want to click on that link and you'll be able to sign up so that the next time around you'll be informed ahead of the deadline. One of the boxes you can check is for grant opportunities so that you'll specifically hear about those when they come out.
Thanks, Julia. Anything else coming up for anyone?
Maybe while people are thinking, I'll bring one up that I think is kind of a common sticky area in applications, which is that public programming component. So this grant in particular, we said this already, but it's a project support grant, and we define a project as a specific connected set of arts and cultural activities. It has to be by and large arts and culture focused. And then there has to be a public programming component at least. Maybe all of it is a public activity, that's great. Maybe some of it is not a public component. So again, the mural example, you have hired a muralist to build a mural on its own, not public programming. Another example would be if you're holding activities in a school during the school day. Technically, that's not a public programming component if it's something that's happening with a closed set of participants. But if there's a component of it, so say at the end of that, project, there's an exhibition that you could invite families and the public to, or there's a concert at the end of it that is open to the public, that can certainly count as a project by our definition. Ultimately, everyone who does a project support grant is required to submit their public programming as an event on our events site, clevelandartsevents.com. And so, this is a public calendar of arts and cultural events happening around the region. And so the idea is that you need to have something that's appropriate to post there. It's perfectly acceptable to have public programming that doesn't mean it's appropriate for every single person. For example, you have a summer camp that's open to kids in grades 4 through 8. That's fine. That can count as public programming, as long as it's something that can be advertised broadly and widely, and anyone who, meets that category has a chance to participate. Another example might be, we regularly make a grant to the Rape Crisis Center in Cleveland, and their programming is certainly not appropriate for anyone to come to, but anyone does have the opportunity to if they have experienced the issues that those programs are created for. I'm trying to think of any other examples there. It's kind of a sticky, tricky area, and so if you want to talk to us ahead of time before you start working on the application, if your idea is going to be eligible or not, we'd be happy to connect around that on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, I think you gave good examples. I was going to say, like, also a theater summer camp. I think you gave a similar example, like it's for a specific group, but maybe there's a performance at the end. And there's a lot of like sometimes like with the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center or other art therapists where it's open to a specific demographic of people, but there is a culminating event of some sort where there's a public exhibit. Sorry, my dog is barking a lot. Just wondering, let's see. I'm not seeing anything else in the chat. You're welcome to also come off mute. Oh, something came in. Okay, so Lori asked, if your event does attract a wide audience, how do you define community? I'm referring to our One World Day event, which draws tens of thousands from the region. It's a great question. In that case, you are doing your best to define the people that typically attend the event. That might be families in Northeast Ohio. It might be specific people who are related to the cultural gardens or cultural institutions and their families. And I don't know, Julie, if you have a better explanation for that.
Yeah, I think this is actually a really good example that goes along with a graphic that we showed earlier in the slideshow that was kind of like 3 concentric circles. The first, the innermost circle is you and your organization, the people who do the work, who are maybe paid staffers or the board or whoever those core, volunteers are who organize this. And then the first exterior circle is, your core community. And so I think in your case, the core community is actually like the partner gardens, all of the other small organizations that you engage to do the work, who are regularly there participating in your programming, who you are designed to serve directly. And then the third ring of that circle is the wider public, which you do a wonderful job of reaching in this type of event. And so I think that the question around community, you can kind of address that way and say, well, our core community is, the organizations who have gardens here, and here's how we're serving them through this event, and here's how we're reaching the wider audience also through this specific event. I think that, you can be accurate and say that it's a really broad swath of people, and that is an accurate response in this situation. It's also reasonable for smaller organizations to say, you know what, we really only work in this neighborhood, but we know our neighbors, and that's like perfectly valid response too. I just think a lot of small organizations maybe feel pressure to show that they're a place for every single person and fail to really communicate that they know and respect their own small audience, and that, numbers, CAC doesn't say, oh, you need to reach 100,000 people at your event. That's not something that your application will get scored on. And so we just want to make sure that projects of all size have a place in this in this program. Let's see, another question. Can the overall budget include items that aren't fundable by the grant? For example, if our event includes a reception, could that be part of our match amount versus what we're requesting funding for? Yes, certainly. There's lots of projects that happen that have food be a part of them, a major part of them even, but CAC in particular can't pay for the food, but certainly plan your project as you see fit so that those activities can be a part of it. As long as there are enough eligible expenses for CAC to fill out, the budget for the grant amount, you'll be eligible for that amount.
Well, I will say that I'm going to stay on, and I think the grant team is going to stay on as well. But if you had all your questions answered and you don't have anything else, feel free to enjoy the rest of your day. Again, we are always here to answer any questions. You're going to be receiving a follow-up email that will include the recording of this presentation as well as the PDF of the slides and the links that were shared. So if you missed something or missed a link, don't worry about that. And that also will include our information as the grant team, so that you can reach out to us directly. And you should expect that by tomorrow or Thursday at the latest. And we appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Davon, or Julia, or whoever did that. Great. Welcome.